Your man out of Japan, Jay Contra here, and I would like to ask you a pretty simple question with a very complicated answer. Do you have a collection policy? Last year, I worked for a museum as a collections manager. It was sort of a cosmic calling, considering that I've been collecting video games for the last 15 years and managing my own collection. And what a collections manager does is oversee everything that a museum has, as well as to make sure that the objects that a museum has are properly documented and preserved, among other tasks. Something that I learned was that a good museum will have what's called a collection policy. Now, what a collection policy is usually a written statement of what you want to have in your collection. Now, why would a museum have a collection policy? Why would you as a video game collector have a collection policy? Both museums and private collectors only have so many resources. You only have so much time, you only have so much money to make sure that you're taking the proper care of the objects that you own. When you're talking about preserving old objects, and let's talk about video games explicitly here, it's going to take a lot of care and a lot of money and time to make sure that your video games, and especially your video game consoles, are properly taken care of. Think about everything that can happen to a video game console over the years. The plastic can start to yellow. The capacitors can start to leak. Your processors might go on the fritz. I've had a couple of video game consoles die on me. And to make sure that that doesn't happen, you have to ensure that you're doing some preventive maintenance. You're replacing the capacitors. You may be modifying your systems so that they have better performance. Say in the example of a Game Boy Advance, you might put a backlight into it. The games themselves might be under threat. You might have damaged contacts on your cartridges. You might have discs that need to be properly stored so that they aren't affected by humidity or fluctuations in temperature. There are so many things that happen in both the museum and the video game world that are going to affect our collections. You need to be able to manage the resources and the time that you can put into caring for your video game collection. That a collection policy is, I think, a must for any serious video game collector. Let me give you an example of a museum collection policy. A little while ago, I visited a small museum, and they were dedicated to preserving the history of their local county. Their policy was that they would only accept objects that were relevant and related to their county. This means that they can still intake a lot of important historical objects, but it also means that they can say no to certain things. So what do I mean by saying no to something? And this is applicable both to the museum field and to your personal video game collection. Let me give you an example of something this museum said no to. A donor came by and said that they wanted to give the museum a really cool, like early 1900s car. You know, something you don't often come by. Something that is really big and would look really impressive. But the problem is that it wasn't owned by anybody who had lived in the county, and it hadn't really driven the roads there. It was just someone coming in saying, oh, hey, you want a cool old car? Here you go. There will be some museums out there who don't have a collection policy, who would just take it in, but that can be a significant burden. Maintaining that car, finding space to keep that car, could possibly actually ruin the museum, and also could be a huge opportunity cost because that space, time, and money could be going to things that actually have historic relevance to their museum. The real purpose of a collection policy is to make sure that you have a coherent collection that you can take care of and that is relevant to the goals that you want to achieve. The real importance of a collection policy is to guide your collecting goals. And this is something that I have had to deal with my collection over the years, is my collection, because I didn't really have any specific goals, I didn't really have any policy in mind, is that after living in Japan for so many years where I could find relatively cheap video games, I ended up amassing a 1,000 title video game collection that is far beyond my means to actually take control of. And so that's why over the last couple of years, I've been selling things off, and I've also been much more strategic and much more purposeful in my video game collecting. Let me give you my personal video game collection policy. The games that I want in my collection are going to be games that I have beaten or games that I wish I could beat. For example, Dark Souls. I don't know if I'm ever actually going to be able to beat Dark Souls, and that day may very well come, but because I wish I could beat it and I've put some time into it, I'm going to hold on to it. This now opens up the possibility of games that I can get rid of. It's games that I don't really have any particular attachment to, either because, I played it for an hour, didn't like it a whole lot, and now it's just kind of sitting around and taking up space on a shelf. Because of this policy, I can now set up goals for myself. Say, for example, I want to clear every game in the Fire Emblem Saga. That is now an achievable goal, and I can now look and see, how much are these games going to cost me? What systems am I going to need to maintain in order to play all of these games? And I can now have a much clearer picture of what my collection is going to look like down the road. I've even thought of changing my collection policy to being games that I'm willing to move. I'll probably be changing my residence one of these days, and moving a 1,000 title video game collection is pretty daunting. It means getting a lot of boxes. It means probably getting a larger U-Haul to move all of that junk. And I don't think I really want to do that. So I think my ultimate collecting policy might just be games that I'm willing to box and ship somewhere when I move. Because that's another factor. It's another factor in terms of time, money, and effort that I have to consider when I pick up a video game. It's also something I have to consider when I look at all the consoles that I have, that, these are going to take a lot of space to ship, a lot of money to ship, and perhaps the even more anxiety-inducing thing to consider is to maintain. All of your consoles are slowly dying in one way or another, and you're going to have to think about replacing those capacitors. And in the games also, you're going to have to think about all of the save batteries that you're going to have to replace. It means possibly learning how to solder things. It also is a consideration to have to send these off somewhere to have someone else do the maintenance work on your games and your consoles. So having a collection policy is really going to make the difference and make sure that you manage your resources and your time. So I would say for any serious video game collector, a collection policy is something you really need to think about. Maybe you don't necessarily need to write it down, but I would highly recommend doing that, as well as writing down your collecting goals for, say, the next year to 3 to 5 years, so that you make sure that you're not doing what I did in the past. Learn from my mistakes and make sure that you're not buying games that you don't really care about, that you're not getting hyped about games that you don't really have a connection with, because you only have so much money, you only have so much time, and you only have so much effort that you can put into your video game collection, and you want to make sure that you're doing things right. I've been your man out of Japan, Jay Contra. I stream every Sunday over at twitch.tv/JayContra at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Sometimes we're playing games. Sometimes we're talking about retro game collecting. I hope I see you there. Again, twitch.tv/JayContra. Thanks for watching. See you next time, and mahalo.